The rancher ordered a bride, but a famous prostitute walked off the wagon. That should have been the end of it. Just a simple mistake, a letter gone wrong. But the moment Tobias Crow laid eyes on Violet McCall, he knew nothing about this was simple. The dust from the wagon wheels was still hanging in the air, thick and golden in the late afternoon sun, and something was already terribly wrong. He'd corresponded for 3 months with a woman named Sarah Beth Collins, a God-fearing widow from Missouri. Plain, practical, looking for an honest life. This woman was not Sarah Beth. This woman wore a crimson dress that looked like it was spun from sin itself, clinging to curves that could make a saint curse. Her lips were painted a bold red, and she smiled like she knew every dark thought he'd ever had. She surveyed his small, dusty ranch not like a prospective wife, but like a queen inspecting a new territory she intended to conquer. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, pinned up in a way that had no business being on the frontier. And then her eyes, green as new spring leaves, met his. Tobias felt a jolt run through him, something primal and dangerous that had nothing to do with being disappointed and everything to do with being hunted. He stood frozen on his porch, his worn hat clutched in his hands. The wagon driver, a scrawny man with fear in his eyes, scrambled down from his seat. He scurried over to Tobias, twisting the brim of his own hat. "Mr. Crow," he stammered, his voice thin. "Got your package," as if this vision in red was a sack of flour. Tobias forced his legs to move, his boots thudding on the wooden porch steps. He was a simple man. He worked the land, he missed his wife, and he was lonely. That was all. This woman, she was a complication he couldn't afford. She was a fire, and he was living in a house made of dry timber. "There's been a mistake," Tobias said, his voice a low growl. He gestured at her, a helpless, angry motion. "I ordered a wife, not this." Violet McCall laughed. The sound wasn't sweet. It was like whiskey and smoke, the kind of laugh you'd hear in a saloon right before the shooting started. "No mistake, darling," she said, her voice a slow southern drawl that wrapped around his name and squeezed. "Though I admit the situation is a tad more complex than you were led to believe." She reached into a small beaded purse and pulled out a letter. The paper was yellowed, creased from being read and reread. It was Sarah Beth's handwriting. He knew it instantly. "Sarah Beth Collins sent me," Violet explained, her smile turning sharp as a knife's edge. "Says she found the Lord and couldn't possibly leave her missionary work." She paused, letting the lie hang in the air between them. "She also said to tell you that what a man like you really needs isn't a wife. It's someone who understands the world for what it is." Tobias snatched the letter from her hand. The words swam before his eyes. It was all there, just as Violet had said. But there was more. Sarah Beth wrote about Violet as if she were a gift, a woman who had seen enough of life to appreciate the simple peace he could offer, a woman who could serve him better than any meek little bride ever could. Then he saw the other part, the part written in a slightly more frantic scrawl near the bottom. It mentioned men, dangerous men, men who were looking for Violet, men who wouldn't stop until they had her. It mentioned debts that weren't about money, and sins that chased you across the country, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. His blood ran cold. "What kind of trouble are you in?" Tobias demanded, his eyes flicking from the letter to her face. For a split second, the mask of confidence cracked. He saw something else in her green eyes, something raw, something terrified. "The kind that gets people killed," she whispered. Then the mask was back. "But don't you worry your handsome head, cowboy. I don't plan on staying long enough for it to find me here." That's when he noticed it. The wagon driver was already back in his seat. The reins were in his hands. He hadn't even bothered to unload her trunk. He was leaving. Right now. The realization hit Tobias like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a mistake. This was a delivery. Someone had sent this woman to his doorstep knowing exactly who she was, knowing exactly what kind of hell was riding on her heels. The wagon kicked up a cloud of dust and vanished down the long road, leaving Tobias utterly alone with a woman who belonged on his ranch like a diamond belonged in a pigsty. She just stood there, watching him. Those calculating eyes were weighing him, measuring him, waiting to see what he would do. "You can't stay here," he said, but the words felt like dust in his mouth. The nearest town was 2 days away. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon. He couldn't just leave her out here. "This is a respectable place," he added, trying to sound firm. "I have a name to protect." "Respectable?" She said the word like it tasted foul. That's a word for folks who've never had to choose between their good name and their last breath. She started walking toward him, each step slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. It felt like he was watching a panther stalk its prey. "I understand, Mr. Crow. A woman like me. I could ruin a man like you just by standing too close." The way she said his name made his gut clench. He'd been alone for 3 years. 3 years since Martha died, bringing their son into the world, only for the boy to follow her an hour later. 3 years of silence, broken only by the wind and the lowing of cattle. This woman, this impossible creature, was looking at him like she could see all the lonely, empty spaces inside him. "It's not just my name," he insisted, his voice strained. "You said it yourself. There are men hunting you. I won't have their violence brought onto my land." Violet tilted her head. For the first time, she looked genuinely curious. "Tell me, cowboy, are you afraid of the danger? Or are you afraid of me?" Before he could think of an answer, she was right in front of him. So close he could smell her perfume. It smelled of strange flowers and faraway cities, a scent that cost more than his best bull. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she touched the letter he was still holding. It was like being struck by lightning. "Sarah Beth wrote more than what you read," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She told me about your wife, about the baby, about how you've been letting this ranch become your tomb." The words stole the air from his lungs. Sarah Beth had never known. He'd never told her. He had never told anyone the full story of his grief. "How?" he choked out. "How did she know about Martha?" Violet's smile was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "Sarah Beth Collins and I. We have some history. We both learned what happens when a woman puts her trust in the wrong kind of man." He saw it then, a tiny silver scar along her jaw, almost invisible. He saw the way she stood, perfectly balanced, ready to either fight or flee at a moment's notice. The trouble she was running from wasn't just following her. It had carved itself into her. "The men," she continued, her voice barely audible. "They're not just thugs. They're connected. They have long arms and even longer memories. They don't forgive. They don't forget." An unnatural chill crept up his spine. "What kind of men?" She looked past him, toward the horizon, where the sunset was painting the clouds the color of old blood. "The kind of men who own sheriffs, the kind who buy judges, the kind who can make a person vanish without a trace." She turned back, and the fear in her eyes was real now, stark and undeniable. "But they don't know I'm here," she said. "Not yet." That last word, "yet." It hung in the air between them, both a promise and a death sentence. The first stars began to prick the darkening sky. Tobias made a choice. He knew, even as he made it, that he was stepping off a cliff. "One night," he said, the words heavy as stone. "You can have the spare room for one night, but in the morning, you're gone." A flicker of surprise, of genuine gratitude, crossed her face. "One night," she agreed, her voice soft. She walked over to the trunk the driver had abandoned in the dust. "I should warn you, Mr. Crow. I'm not the kind of houseguest you're used to." He watched her struggle with the heavy leather straps and found himself moving to help her without thinking. His hands covered hers on the brass latch. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the twilight. "I may not approve of your life," he said gruffly, "but I was raised to treat a lady with respect." "Lady?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. It's been a while since anyone's called me that. He lifted the trunk. It was surprisingly light. Had to leave most of my things behind, she said, answering his unspoken question. It's easier to run when you're traveling light. Inside the small ranch house, he lit the lamps. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows. He led her to the spare room. It was the room he and Martha had planned as a nursery. The irony was a bitter pill in his throat. He was putting a prostitute in the room where his children were meant to sleep. It's not much, he mumbled, setting the trunk down. Violet ran a hand over the simple patchwork quilt on the bed. Her touch was reverent, almost gentle. It's perfect, she said, and for the first time, he heard no act in her voice, just pure, unvarnished gratitude. He showed her the water basin and the towels, told her he'd have coffee at dawn. He turned to leave, to put a locked door between them, but he stopped. He had to know. Violet, he said, his back still to her. These men, how long do you really have before they find you? The silence stretched on for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost. They had someone watching Sarah Beth, someone tracking her letters, every single one. She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a terrible knowledge. They know about this place, Tobias, she whispered. They've always known. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Sarah Beth didn't send me here to save me from them. Her voice broke. She sent me here to save you. Her hands were shaking now, the confident woman from the wagon completely gone, replaced by someone small and terrified. The men who are hunting me, they don't just want to punish me. They want to make an example of anyone who helps me. Anyone who shows me a moment of kindness. How long? His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. They were 3 days behind me when I left Kansas City, she choked out. Maybe closer now. She wrapped her arms around her body as if trying to hold herself together. I thought I could just stay one night, get a head start. But it was a lie. A beautiful, stupid lie. Her voice cracked on the last word. If they were tracking her letters, they know everything. Your name, your ranch. They probably know how many cattle you own and what you ate for dinner last Tuesday. These men aren't just outlaws, Tobias. They're a machine. Outside, in the deep darkness, a twig snapped. It could have been a coyote. It could have been the wind. But Tobias had spent 1,000 nights alone on this land. He knew its sounds. He knew its silence. And this wasn't a sound of the land. They're here, he breathed. They're already here. He moved to the window, his body low, and peered through a tiny gap in the curtains. The moon had risen, washing his property in shades of silver and black. He saw the outline of his barn, the long stretch of empty pasture. Nothing. But the feeling was still there. The feeling of being watched. The air was heavy, holding its breath. It's nothing, he said, trying to convince himself as much as her. But his hand was already resting on the stock of the rifle he kept propped by the door. Violet came to stand beside him. She was so close he could feel the heat coming off her skin. You didn't survive out here this long by having a careless imagination, she said softly. If you feel it, it's real. She was right. The silence outside was wrong. It was too deep. His horses were quiet in the barn. His cattle were still. They always sensed trouble before he did. Tell me everything about Sarah Beth, he commanded, his voice urgent. How did she really know about my wife? Violet leaned her head against the cool window pane. Her reflection looked like a ghost in the glass. Sarah Beth Collins isn't her real name, she said after a long, tense moment. Her name is Sarah Beth Morrison, and she was married to Territorial Judge Elias Morrison. The name hit Tobias like a physical blow. Judge Morrison. A name whispered in saloons and printed in newspapers. A man known for his brutal rulings, his connections to railroad barons and wealthy landowners. A man who always got what he wanted. She was his trophy wife, Violet continued, her voice filled with venom, until she found out what his real business was. Land fraud, blackmail, human trafficking, corruption that ran so deep It reached all the way to the Capitol. When she threatened to expose him, he had her declared insane, locked her away in a private asylum where no one would ever listen to her. "How did she get out?" Tobias asked. "She didn't escape," Violet said, and a flicker of defiant pride lit her eyes. "I broke her out." The puzzle pieces were slamming together now, forming a picture more monstrous than he could have imagined. The brothel where I worked. Morrison owned it. It was his headquarters. He used the girls to gather secrets on powerful men. Sarah Beth and we became friends. When he told me what he'd done to his own wife, I couldn't just let it be. "So the men, they work for Morrison," Tobias whispered, the whole terrifying truth laid bare. "They work for the judge," she confirmed. "And they're not just hunting me. They're hunting Sarah Beth. They're hunting anyone who ever helped us." She turned to face him, her eyes pleading. "I swear, Tobias, I didn't know she was writing to you. I didn't know she was sending me to an innocent man. But you came anyway." "I was desperate," she cried. "When you're drowning, you don't ask questions about the hand that pulls you from the water. But I've led them right to you, and I can't live with that." Outside, a horse whinnied. It was a sharp, anxious sound. Both of them froze. That wasn't the sound of a horse spooked by a predator. It was the sound of a horse reacting to the presence of unfamiliar men. "How many?" Tobias asked, already moving toward the small cabinet where he kept his shotgun. "Morrison's personal crew is at least 6 men," Violet said, her voice steady now, hardened by the immediate threat. "They're ex-soldiers, former lawmen, the kind of men who shoot first and never ask questions at all. This isn't a fair fight, Tobias. They're killers." He broke open the shotgun, his hands moving with practiced ease, and began feeding shells into the chamber. "Maybe not. But this is my land, and I know every rock and every ravine on it." "You don't get it!" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "They don't just kill you. They erase you. They'll burn your ranch, ruin your name, make sure no one ever remembers you existed. Morrison has the law in his pocket. He is the law." Then they heard it. The soft, deliberate crunch of a boot on the dry ground just outside the front door. Someone was on his porch. Tobias held up a hand, signaling for silence. He crept toward the door, shotgun held at the ready. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. The man outside was a hunter. He was patient. "3 years ago," Violet whispered, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it. "You filed a lawsuit against the Territorial Railroad Commission, do you remember?" He froze, his hand inches from the doorknob. Of course he remembered. The railroad had tried to seize a quarter of his land, claiming eminent domain. He'd fought them. He'd taken them to court, and against all odds, he had won. It had cost him nearly everything he had, but he had won. "Judge Morrison," she breathed, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. "He was the judge who ruled against you in the first trial, before you appealed. Your victory cost him a fortune in bribes from the railroad. It all clicked into place. This was never about Violet. Not really. She was just the excuse. This was revenge. This was Morrison tying up a loose end. A stubborn rancher who had dared to defy him. "Sarah Beth sent you here as a warning," he said, the terrible truth settling in his bones. "She knew they were coming for me anyway." She thought if you were caught harboring a fugitive, they'd have an excuse," Violet whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She was trying to give you a chance to see them coming." Crash! Glass shattered at the back of the house. The heavy thud of boots hitting his kitchen floorboards followed an instant later. They weren't waiting. They weren't negotiating. They were here to execute him. Tobias grabbed Violet's hand, pulling her toward the back of the house, but the sound of more men moving outside told him it was too late. Every exit was covered. They were trapped, boxed in. "The cellar," he hissed, yanking her toward the stone fireplace. He kicked aside a bearskin rug, revealing a heavy iron ring set into the floor. "There's a tunnel. It leads to the barn." "Tobias Crow!" A voice boomed from outside. It was a calm, professional voice, which made it all the more chilling. This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of one Violet McCall, and for any man found harboring her. A federal marshal. Morrison's reach was even longer than she'd feared. "We know you're in there!" the voice called again. "Come out now and no one gets hurt!" Violet squeezed his hand, her knuckles white. "That's not a real marshal," she whispered frantically. "Crawford is Morrison's right-hand man. I've seen him. They're not here to arrest anyone." More footsteps echoed from his kitchen. Methodical, unhurried. They were sweeping the house room by room. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Tobias heaved the trapdoor open, revealing a rickety wooden ladder descending into blackness. The air that rose up smelled of damp earth and potatoes. "Go," he urged her. She shook her head, her green eyes blazing with defiance in the lamplight. "No, you first. If they get you, I'm dead anyway. Besides," she added with a grim smile, "I have more experience running from monsters than you do." Before he could argue, she grabbed the front of his shirt, pulled him close, and kissed him. It was a hard, desperate kiss, tasting of fear and gunpowder and a sliver of impossible hope. "For luck," she whispered against his lips. Then the front door splintered, exploding inward off its hinges, and their time was up. Tobias didn't hesitate. He dropped through the opening, landing with a jarring thud on the packed earth of the root cellar. It was pitch black, but he knew the way. Above, Violet scrambled down after him, pulling the heavy door shut just as the thunder of heavy boots filled his living room. "This way," he whispered, grabbing her hand and pulling her into the narrow, hand-dug tunnel. The walls were rough stone, scraping at their shoulders as they moved. They had to go single file, plunging deeper into the suffocating darkness beneath his home. Muffled shouts echoed from the house above. "Find them! Tear this place apart!" "Crawford wants them alive," another voice answered. "Those were the judge's orders." Violet stumbled behind him, her breath catching in her throat. "Alive?" she whispered in the dark. "Why would Morrison want us alive?" Tobias didn't want to think about the answer. A man like Morrison didn't show mercy. If he wanted them alive, it was because death was the easy way out. He wanted something from them first. The tunnel began to slope upward. He could smell it now, hay and horses. They were close to the barn, but that was no comfort. If Crawford's men were as good as Violet claimed, they'd have someone watching the only other building on the property. The barn was the most obvious escape route. It was a trap. "There was something else," Violet said, her voice tight with strain as they climbed. "In the letter, something I didn't tell you." He stopped. Even now, with killers just feet away, she was holding back. "What is it?" "Sarah Beth. She wrote about a safe, an old iron safe you inherited from your wife's family. She said there were documents inside. Documents that could be dangerous in the wrong hands." The world stopped turning. Martha's safe. He'd completely forgotten. It was in the barn loft, buried under a decade of junk. His father-in-law, Martha's father, had been a surveyor for the territorial government. He'd spent his life mapping the frontier. "The maps," Tobias breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Her father. He mapped mineral deposits, water rights, things the government never put on the official records, things that could be worth a fortune. Or things that could prove the official records were a lie, Violet finished, her voice filled with a new, terrifying understanding. "This isn't about your lawsuit, Tobias. It's about you owning the evidence that could destroy Morrison and his entire network." Creak. The sound of the large barn door groaning open came from directly above them. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossed the wooden floor. Someone was in the barn. Searching. They were trapped, the men in the house behind them, and another one waiting at their only exit. "We need those maps," Violet whispered urgently. "They're our only chance. As long as he doesn't have them, Morrison can't afford to kill us." "They're in the loft," Tobias whispered back, 20 feet directly above the man who's looking for us. Through the thin cracks in the floorboards above their heads, they could just make out the dark shape of a man moving through the stalls, a rifle held at the ready. He was methodical, thorough, and he was getting closer to the hidden tunnel exit with every step he took. The flaw in their plan was suddenly, horribly obvious. The exit was almost directly beneath the ladder to the loft. To get their only piece of leverage, they would have to expose themselves in the worst possible spot. The footsteps stopped, directly overhead. They were out of time. Violet pressed something small, cold, and heavy into his hand. He recognized the shape instantly. A derringer. A lady's gun. 2 shots, she breathed against his ear. Make them count. I can't ask you to do this. You're not asking, she hissed, her eyes glinting in the faint moonlight filtering down. And I've been in worse spots than this. The man above them turned and started toward the loft ladder. It was now or never. If he got up there, he'd have the high ground. They'd be fish in a barrel. Tobias made his choice. He shoved the tunnel exit door open, a disguised section of the floorboards, and rolled out behind a stack of hay bales, the tiny pistol gripped tight in his hand. The man, his back to them, was just placing a boot on the first rung of the ladder. "Don't move!" Tobias said, his voice a low growl. The man spun, impossibly fast, his rifle swinging around. But he wasn't fast enough. Violet was already out of the tunnel, a blur of motion in the shadows. She snatched a pitchfork from the wall and, in one fluid movement, slammed the sharp steel tines against the man's back, pinning him to the ladder. He grunted in pain, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Deputy Marshal Crawford, I presume?" Violet purred, her voice dripping with venom. "Funny. I don't see a badge." Crawford was a big man, his face a roadmap of old scars. He didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. That made him infinitely more dangerous. "Miss McCall, the judge sends his regards. He's very eager to see you again." "I'm sure he is," Violet snapped. "Right up until those survey maps find their way to a real federal marshal." Her voice was pure steel, a high-stakes bluff that Tobias prayed would work. "Tell me, Crawford, does the judge know that Tobias here finally figured out what his father-in-law was mapping?" A flicker of something, uncertainty, maybe greed, crossed Crawford's face. "What maps?" he grunted. The question came too fast. He was faking it. Or was he? No. He genuinely didn't know. Morrison had sent his men to kill a rancher and grab a woman, but he hadn't told them the real reason why. He hadn't told them about the treasure hidden right under their noses. "The maps," Tobias said, stepping out of the shadows, his voice steady. "The ones that prove Judge Morrison has been selling fake mineral rights to the railroad companies for 10 years. The ones that document every bribe, every falsified report, every acre of federal land he's sold illegally." Crawford's face went white under his trail dust. A conspiracy that big. It wouldn't just ruin Morrison. It would bring down everyone. Every politician, every lawman, every hired gun who had ever taken his money. Men like Crawford would be swinging from a federal gallows. "You're lying," Crawford snarled, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Then why are you here?" Violet demanded, shoving the pitchfork harder. "Why send a team of 6 professional killers for one washed-up prostitute and one lonely rancher? What's so damned important about this piece of dirt?" It was then that they heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats. A lot of them. Moving fast. Tobias peered through a grimy barn window. He could see them now, at least 4 riders, torches held high, galloping straight for the ranch. "Your backup?" Tobias asked Crawford. A slow, cruel smile spread across Crawford's face. "Insurance," he sneered. "The judge doesn't like loose ends, especially loose ends who might start blabbing about imaginary maps." Violet met Tobias's gaze across the dimly lit barn. In her eyes, he saw the same horrifying realization that was dawning in his own mind. Those men weren't backup. They were a cleanup crew. Morrison wasn't just sending them to kill Tobias and Violet. He was sending them to kill everyone. Crawford and his men knew too much. They had become liabilities. "Those men aren't here for us," Tobias said, letting the truth sink in. "They're here for you." For the first time since he'd stepped off that ladder, Deputy Marshal Crawford looked terrified. Fear can be a powerful motivator. Faced with a choice between a quick death from Morrison's executioners and a slim chance of survival with his captives, Crawford made a deal. "There's a trail," he said, his voice rushed. "Through the canyon. It's the only way out of this valley. They won't be watching. My horse is out back. We go now. We might make it." "After we get the maps," Violet stated, not moving the pitchfork an inch. Tobias didn't waste a second. He scrambled up the ladder to the loft, Crawford's own rifle now in his hands. The safe was right where he'd left it, tucked under a rotting canvas tarp. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the combination. He could hear the riders getting closer, their shouts carrying on the night air. The heavy lock clicked open. Inside, yellowed and brittle with age, were the scrolls. Dozens of them. Martha's father had been meticulous. His elegant script detailed every fraudulent claim, every illegal boundary line, every secret deposit of gold and silver that Morrison had built his empire on. It was all there. A confession written in ink and survey lines. "Got them!" he yelled, shoving the priceless documents down the front of his shirt. He looked out the loft window. The riders were in the yard now. They weren't lawmen. They were shadows on horseback, their faces obscured, their movements efficient and brutal. They were already dousing the corners of his house with oil. Crawford was right. They were here to burn it all to the ground, leaving nothing behind but ash and secrets. "Move!" Violet screamed. The three of them, rancher, prostitute, and killer, bolted from the back of the barn. Crawford's horse, a powerful bay, was tethered to a post. Crawford leaped into the saddle, then hauled Violet up behind him. Tobias untied his own horse from the corral, swinging himself onto its back in a single motion. They rode like the devil himself was chasing them, which, in a way, he was. Behind them, a brilliant orange flower bloomed in the darkness as his home, his past, everything he had ever built, went up in flames. The house where he and Martha had dreamed of a future. The barn he'd raised with his own two hands, all of it turning to smoke. But Crawford knew the land. He led them down a treacherous, winding path into the canyon, a trail so narrow and dark that Morrison's men would never find it. They rode all night, the fire at their backs eventually fading to a dull glow against the stars. By dawn, they were miles away, tired, battered, but alive. 3 days later, they were in the territorial capital, standing in the office of the one man Morrison couldn't buy, Federal Marshal William Hayes. The survey maps were spread across Hayes's massive oak desk. He stared at them, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. This is the biggest case of corruption this territory has ever seen," Hayes declared, his voice a low rumble. "Judge Morrison is finished. With these maps, and your testimony," he said, nodding to a grim-faced Crawford, "we can bring down his entire organization." Crawford, who had been promised immunity for his cooperation, looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "His network goes all the way to Washington," he said quietly. "This won't just take down the judge, this will burn half the territorial government to the ground." Tobias wasn't listening. He was watching Violet. She stood by the window, looking down at the bustling city below. She had been quiet for 3 days, the reality of her freedom slowly sinking in. The running was over. When they were finally alone, standing on the steps of the federal building, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "What now?" She turned to him. The fear was gone from her green eyes. In its place was a calm, steady light he'd never seen before. "Now," she said, "I testify. I watched them put Morrison in a cage for the rest of his life." She stepped closer, so close he could smell the simple soap she'd used at the hotel, not the exotic perfume she'd worn that first night. "And then, if you'll have me, I'd like to help you rebuild." "I don't have a ranch anymore, Violet. They burned it." "You have the land," she countered, a soft smile playing on her lips. "And Marshal Hayes says the government will compensate you for everything you lost, plus damages." She reached out and took his hand. "Besides, I've got a little money saved, enough for some lumber and a few head of cattle." 6 months later, Tobias Crow stood on the porch of a new house, built on the ashes of the old one. He watched his wife, Violet, tending to the rows of vegetables she'd planted. She'd traded her silk dresses for durable denim, her painted lips for a smile that was real and true. She hadn't just helped him rebuild a ranch. She had helped him rebuild his life. The lonely, broken man who had ordered a bride was gone. In his place was a man who knew that sometimes the biggest mistakes turn out to be the greatest blessings. Judge Morrison was sentenced to life in a federal penitentiary where he was found dead in his cell less than 2 years later. The maps became the basis for new federal laws, protecting the land and the people who lived on it. Justice, it turned out, could sometimes be found, even in the Wild West. Every now and then, Tobias would find Violet sitting on the porch as the sun went down, just watching the horizon, and he knew she was thinking about how far they had come. The rancher had ordered a wife, a simple, plain woman, to share his quiet life. Instead, a legend walked off that wagon and brought with her a fire that burned down his old world and forged a new one, a better one, right in its place. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of redemption and frontier justice. And if you have a story about a time when a mistake turned into a miracle, share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear it.